In October 1501, 50 women were brought into the Vatican. What happened next was written down by the Pope's own chief of staff, locked in an archive and kept hidden for 350 years. That document is just one of the things we're going to talk about today, because the story of Cesare Borgia, the man who terrified all of Italy, is so much stranger, so much darker, and so much more extraordinary than anything you've been told. Most people know the name, very few people know what's actually behind it. Today, we're going to fix that. Here is what the history books usually say. Cesare Borgia was a ruthless Renaissance prince, son of a corrupt pope, possibly the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince, possibly in an incestuous relationship with his sister, died young. The end. Every single one of those points is either incomplete, distorted, or in one case, a deliberate lie started by a man who had been publicly declared impotent and wanted revenge. The real story is something else entirely. We're going to go through 12 things about Cesare Borgia that almost nobody talks about, and by the end, I promise you, the reality is going to be considerably more disturbing than the legend. Let's start with the thing that set everything in motion. No cardinal in the 1,000-year history of the Catholic Church had ever resigned. Not once. There was no rule for it, no procedure, no precedent. The assumption baked into church law was that a cardinal served until he died. Full stop. So when Cesare walked into the College of Cardinals in 1498 and announced he was leaving, the institution simply had no idea what to do with him. And the cardinal's response tells you everything about how terrified people already were of crossing the Borgias. Several of them didn't show up to vote. Their official excuse: there was plague in the city, the air was unhealthy, better to stay in the countryside. The Pope saw through it immediately. He wrote to every absent cardinal in the region and told them to get back to Rome because, he said, matters concerning the welfare of the church were to be discussed. That was papal code for "I know exactly what you're doing, and if you don't come back, I will make your life very difficult." They came back, they voted, they created in real time a legal mechanism that had never existed before, purely because Alexander VI wanted it and nobody dared refuse him. But here's the part nobody mentions. The entire resignation was a business transaction. Louis XII of France wanted a divorce. The Pope wanted French military support for his son, so they made a deal. Cesare's freedom from the church was traded for a king's marriage annulment. The day Cesare shed his cardinal's robes, Louis XII made him Duke of Valentinois. The very next morning, Cesare went to a hunting park, dressed as a warrior, and put on a public display of strength and horsemanship in front of an audience. He was 23 years old. He had just forced the creation of a legal category that didn't exist, and he'd done it by exploiting the one thing more powerful than church law, a pope who would do anything for his son. That's important, but what he did with that freedom is where things start to get genuinely extraordinary. By 1502, Cesare had conquered Romagna, a lawless region of central Italy that had been ruled by petty tyrants for generations. To pacify it quickly, he appointed a Spanish governor named Ramiro d'Orco and gave him unlimited authority. Ramiro did what you'd expect a man with unlimited authority and no conscience to do. He tortured people, he executed people, he terrorized the population into submission. It worked. Within months, Romagna was quiet. But now Cesare had a different problem. The people of Romagna hated their new ruler. And that hatred was going to transfer upward to Cesare. His solution was extraordinary. On Christmas morning 1502, the citizens of Cesena walked into the town square and found Ramiro d'Orco's body in two pieces, sliced in half, laid out in the piazza. Beside the corpse, a wooden chopping block and a bloody knife. No explanation, no announcement, just the body, the block, and the knife. Machiavelli, who was watching, wrote that the spectacle caused the people to be at once satisfied and dismayed. Satisfied because the man who had tortured their neighbours was dead. Dismayed because whatever had arranged this was something far more calculating than a brutal governor. That was precisely the point. Cesare had ordered every one of Ramiro's cruelties. He had designed the terror campaign himself. But by staging this execution, he made Ramiro the villain and himself the hero, the just prince who punishes excess. The people of Romagna didn't just accept Borgia rule after this, they defended it when rival lords later tried to retake the region and hoped local resentment would help them. They were baffled to find the population loyal to Cesare. He hadn't just killed his governor, he had rewritten the story of the previous 2 years with one corpse on a cold Christmas morning. Machiavelli spent an entire chapter of The Prince on this episode. His conclusion: a wise ruler uses harsh men to do harsh things, then removes them when the harshness has done its work. The removal itself becomes a demonstration of justice. What Machiavelli didn't say, but what is implicit in everything he wrote about Cesare, is that this only works if the prince has the coldness to plan a man's death before the man has done anything wrong. Ramiro was executed not for failure but for success. He had done exactly what Cesare needed, and that was precisely why he had to die. Now. That same autumn, Cesare was also dealing with something far more dangerous than an inconvenient governor. Several of his most powerful military commanders, men he had hired, trusted, fought alongside, grew frightened by his growing ambition and formed a conspiracy against him. Their plan was to move against Cesare with their combined forces before he could react. He found out his response was to do nothing, or rather, to appear to do nothing. He sent letters to the conspirators. Full of warmth and reassurance, he brought his personal charm to bear on the most wavering of them, sat with him for hours, and gave him a formal treaty of reconciliation to take back to the others. The conspirators signed it. They genuinely believed he was trying to make peace. Then, 3 days before Christmas, specifically to lower everyone's guard, he publicly sent his French reinforcements away. Visibly, he wanted the conspirators to see him reducing his forces. He wanted them relaxed. He ordered them to capture the coastal town of Senigallia. They did. Then he suggested he come to them. They agreed. On December the 31st, Cesare arrived at Senigallia with his army. He greeted the conspirators with enormous warmth, smiling, embracing, seemingly delighted to see them. His officers were also smiling, also warmly attentive, also steering the conspirators gently away from their own troops. By the time anyone realized what was happening, Cesare's army had quietly cut every one of them off from the men they had brought with them. They were taken into a house. The signal was given. The smiling stopped. That night, 2 of the conspirators, Vitellozzo and Oliverotto, were brought out, seated back to back on a bench. A cord was looped around both their necks. An iron bar was inserted through the cord and twisted. They were strangled simultaneously, facing away from each other in the first minutes of 1503. Machiavelli called it a rare and wonderful exploit. He meant it as a compliment, possibly the most disturbing compliment in the history of political philosophy. Venice and Florence sent official letters of congratulation, and Machiavelli was there for all of it, because at this point the most famous political thinker in history was essentially embedded with the most feared man in Italy. Watching him work, Niccolo Machiavelli arrived at Cesare's court in October 1502 as a Florentine diplomat, officially neutral, professionally observant, personally awestruck. He was not yet the man who would right the prince. He was a mid-level government official sent to watch Cesare and report back on what he was doing. What he watched was the entire Senigallia operation unfold in real time. He sent dispatch after dispatch back to Florence describing what he was seeing, clearly struggling to process it. The letters survive. In one, he writes that Cesare never does anything without a reason, and everything he does has a logic that only becomes clear afterward. In another, he describes Cesare as moving with the speed of lightning and the decisiveness of fate. These are not the words of a detached observer. These are the words of a man who is genuinely shaken by what he's watching. Here is the detail almost nobody mentions. Machiavelli was present at Cesare's court during a period when Cesare was simultaneously conducting a fake peace negotiation with men he was planning to murder, managing military logistics across multiple cities, corresponding with the Pope in Rome, and keeping Leonardo da Vinci busy mapping fortifications nearby, all at once, and appearing to everyone around him completely relaxed. When Machiavelli sat down years later to write The Prince, his guide to how a ruler must actually behave to survive, he didn't use classical Roman examples as his model. He used the man he had watched in Cesena and Senigallia and Imola, the chapter on pacifying a conquered territory, Ramiro, the chapter on the danger of relying on inherited power, Cesare's collapse after his father died, the chapter on fortune being a river that can be channeled but not controlled, almost certainly written with Cesare's spectacular rise and fall directly in mind. The man who inspired the most read, most applied book in the history of political thought was also at this exact moment employing the greatest artist in the world as his military engineer. In the summer of 1502, Leonardo da Vinci, then 50 years old, between patrons and looking for work, signed on as military engineer to the most feared man in Italy. This is not disputed. What is almost never discussed is the specific document that governed their arrangement and why it took nearly 3 centuries to find it. The letter was buried in an archive and not discovered until 1792. When researchers finally read it, they found Cesare had given Leonardo a title, Architect and Engineer General, and attached to that title was something unprecedented, a standing order addressed to every military officer and commander in Borgia-held territory, instructing them to assist Leonardo in whatever he needed, give him access to any fortification or construction site, and support him in any way he required. The penalty for non-compliance was incurring Cesare Borgia's personal wrath. In an Italy where cities were surrendering at the mere approach of Borgia's army, that was not a decoration. That was a skeleton key to every fortified position from Rome to the Adriatic coast. Leonardo used it. He spent months travelling from town to town. Imola, Urbino, Pesaro, Rimini, surveying, sketching, measuring. He was 50 years old and, by most accounts, enjoying himself enormously. He was being paid, housed and protected by the most powerful secular figure in Italy, with unlimited access to a military laboratory the size of a region. What he produced in those months included what is now considered the first scientific bird's-eye view map in history, a precise, measured overhead rendering of the city of Imola, drawn not from the ground, but as if from the sky. No one had ever drawn a map like it. It wasn't made as art. It was made as a weapon, a tool for planning sieges and calculating defensive positions. It accidentally became one of the most important documents in the history of cartography. The partnership ended when Cesare lured several of his own generals to a peace dinner and had them strangled on New Year's Day. Leonardo quietly resigned shortly after. Some historians believe the murders were the final straw. If you're finding this as extraordinary as I am, drop a comment below. I want to know which of these details is hitting hardest for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a very good moment because we go this deep on a lot of these stories. Now, let's talk about the incest rumour, because this one has a very specific origin and it is not what you think. The allegations between Cesare and his sister Lucrezia originated with Lucrezia's first husband, Giovanni Sforza. The Borgias needed Lucrezia out of that marriage to Giovanni had become politically useless. The simplest mechanism for dissolving a church marriage was to declare it unconsummated, to claim legally that Giovanni was impotent and the marriage had never been physically completed. This was also, in Giovanni Sforza's case, staggeringly insulting. His previous wife had died in childbirth. The man was demonstrably not impotent, but the Borgias had the Pope, the lawyers, and the power. Giovanni was declared impotent on the record. The marriage was annulled. He was sent home. And then he told everyone that the only reason the Pope wanted Lucrezia back was to keep her for himself sexually. That's it. That's the entire origin. One furious, humiliated man making the most damaging accusation he could think of with no evidence, because he had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. His claim spread because the Borgias had enemies everywhere who were desperate for ammunition. By the time it reached Venice, it had hardened into received fact. Scholars, using actual papal records and family letters, have since established clearly that there is no credible evidence the relationship ever existed. The rumour has no foundation beyond a scorned ex-husband's rage. But it worked. For 500 years it worked. Giovanni Sforza was stripped of his wife, his dignity, and his political standing by the most powerful family in Italy. In return, he destroyed their reputation for half a millennium. That is either a remarkable act of vengeance or a remarkable cautionary tale about the durability of a well-placed lie, possibly both. Now, the Vatican document. Johann Burchard was not a gossip. He was not an enemy of the Borgias. He was the Pope's own chief protocol officer, the man responsible for running every Vatican ceremony with precise, meticulous accuracy. His diary was essentially the official internal record of papal court life. On October 31st, 1501, he wrote down what happened in Cesare Borgia's apartment. According to Burchard, 50 women were brought to the Vatican. After dinner, the candelabras were moved from the tables to the floor. Chestnuts were scattered across the tiles. The women crawled through the candlelight to collect them, while the Pope, Cesare, and Lucrezia watched from above. Then prizes were announced: silk tunics, shoes, fine clothing, for whoever performed the most sexual acts with the guests. The Pope himself distributed the prizes. The diary went into the Vatican archive. It stayed there for 350 years. When Pope Leo XIII finally opened the archive to researchers in the 19th century, he specifically expressed reluctance to allow access to documents that might harm the reputation of Alexander VI, and his own archivist had to argue the case for scholarly access. A second witness exists. An Italian military commander named Silvio Savelli also attended the event and wrote a letter about it afterward. He confirmed the women were present and that they greeted guests with, his exact words, a most shocking sight. He apparently felt he didn't need to elaborate further. The Vatican's official position, maintained by certain historians to this day, is that Burchard's account was either exaggerated or fabricated by later enemies of the Church, but Burchard was the Pope's own man. His diary is exhaustive and methodical across hundreds of entries, and the Church spent 3.5 centuries making sure almost nobody read this particular one. Therefore, we arrive at the decision that ended everything. When Pope Alexander VI died in August 1503, Cesare was lying sick in Castel Sant'Angelo with malarial fever, probably contracted on the same occasion that killed his father, and he was the most powerful secular figure in Italy, and he could not stand up. The conclave to elect a new pope was happening around him, and he could not physically attend. He used his influence from his sickbed. He got a Borgia ally elected, Pius III. Pius III lasted 26 days before dying of illness. Now, Cesare faced the real problem. The leading candidate for the next pope was Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, a man who had spent years as a committed Borgia enemy, who had once fled Rome to escape Alexander VI, and who had publicly stated he would never live in rooms where a Borgia had slept. Della Rovere approached the weakened Cesare and offered him a deal. support his election, and he would continue Borgia policies in the Romagna, keep Cesare in his military position, and pay him generously. Cesare took the deal. Why? Because he had almost no cards left. He was ill, his father was dead, his enemies were circling, and Della Rovere was going to be elected regardless. He calculated that a promise of support, even from a known enemy, was better than open hostility. The day Julius II was crowned, he had Cesare's papal apartments stripped bare. He refused to confirm him as Duke of the Romagna. He demanded the return of every city Cesare controlled. He had him arrested. He had him shipped to Spain in chains. The man Cesare had handed the papacy to used it methodically and without mercy to dismantle everything Cesare had built. Julius had known exactly what he was doing when he made the offer. Cesare had known too. He just had no better choice. But Cesare escaped from Spanish prison, twice actually, and then tried to fight his way back to relevance in the service of the King of Navarre. On the night of March 11th, 1507, during a storm, a small group of enemy soldiers managed to sneak a supply convoy into a besieged castle. Cesare, furious at the audacity of it, rode out to intercept them with 70 horsemen at his back. He rode too fast. His men didn't keep up. By the time the enemy soldiers turned and saw only one pursuer bearing down on them, it was too late for Cesare to stop. 3 men turned to face him. As he raised his arm to strike, one of them put a lance through the gap in his armor, directly beneath his armpit. He fell from his horse and kept fighting. They stabbed him 25 more times. When it was done, they stripped his body of everything valuable, his armor, his clothes, his weapons, and a leather mask that had been covering half his face, because by this point syphilis had so ravaged his once renowned good looks that he had taken to wearing one in public. They had no idea who he was. They had been given explicit orders to capture Cesare Borgia alive. He was worth an enormous ransom, but they hadn't recognized him riding through a storm in the dark. They left him naked in the road, covered his body with a roof tile, and rode back to report what had happened. It was only when Cesare's young squire was shown the stripped armor and burst into tears that the attackers realized what they had done. The commander erupted in rage. An irreplaceable prize gone. 3 days later would have been the Ides of March, the very date on which Julius Caesar, the man Cesare had named himself after and modelled his life on, had been assassinated. He missed it by 72 hours. The man who had terrified Italy, who had strangled generals on New Year's Day and made entire cities surrender without a fight, died alone in the dark on a country road, unrecognised, covered in mud and rain. He was 31 years old. His brother-in-law, the King of Navarre, had him buried in a marble mausoleum inside a church in Viana. The inscription on the tomb read, "Here lies in a little earth he whom everyone feared." It didn't last. A local bishop later decided it was inappropriate, his word was degenerate, for such a man to be interred in consecrated ground. He had the tomb destroyed and Borgia's bones expelled from the church. They were reburied under the street outside, directly in the path of pedestrian traffic, so the citizens of Viana could walk over him as they went about their lives. The bones remained under the street for centuries. By 1953, they had been moved to the local town hall, then to a simple grave just outside the church door. Not under the road anymore, but not inside the building either. In the late 1980s, a campaign began to have Cesare's remains moved back inside, rejected. In 2007, on the 500th anniversary of his death, another attempt was made, rejected again. The church's official position: interior burials are reserved for cardinals and popes. Since Cesare resigned the cardinalate in 1498, he no longer qualifies for a cardinal's burial. The institution that had no mechanism for someone leaving, that had to be threatened and coerced into creating the legal category of cardinal resignation in the first place, is now using that resignation as the reason to keep him in the dirt outside its walls. He is still there, a simple stone slab outside the main door. The inscription reads only Cesare Borgia, generalissimo of the Navarrese and Papal armies, died in the fields of Viana March 12, 1507. Either Caesar or nothing, he had said. He got the nothing, and the book got the everything. Here is what we actually know about Cesare Borgia, and having gone through all of this, he forced the church to invent a legal category that had never existed. He staged a public execution so precisely that it rewrote the political memory of an entire region. He gave Leonardo da Vinci a blank check military passport that produced the first bird's eye city map in history. He set a trap so elaborate and so patient that Machiavelli, watching it unfold in real time, was genuinely shaken. He hosted what may be the most extraordinary event ever held inside the Vatican, recorded by the Pope's own chief of staff and locked away for 3.5 centuries. He was undone by a single act of trust placed in a known enemy in a moment when he had no better option, and he died unrecognised in the rain at 31, stabbed 25 times by men who didn't know his name. The legend says he was a monster. The reality says he was something considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than that. If you want to go deeper on the world that produced Cesare Borgia, the politics, the art, the extraordinary violence of Renaissance Italy, there are videos on this channel that will take you straight there. Watch one after this. You won't regret it. And if you've made it this far, you already know what kind of history you like. Subscribe. We do this every week.